5 years of carefully rebuilt walls crumble in an instant when she walks into her new executive office, only to find her runaway groom sitting behind the CEO's desk. Now, every board meeting becomes a battlefield of unspoken words and suppressed desires, where professional ambition clashes with the ghosts of a love story left unfinished. Some say time heals all wounds, but in the cutthroat world of Korean finance, old scars might just be the beginning of a new chapter. 5 years of carefully built walls came crashing down the moment Lee Seo-yeon stepped into the executive floor of SK Investment and Securities. Her heart stopped when she saw him. Park Min-jae, the man who left her at the altar, sitting behind the CEO's desk like a king on his throne. The glossy marble floors of the 50th floor suddenly felt unsteady beneath her heels. So-yeon clutched her new employee badge tighter, its edges digging into her palm. This was supposed to be her moment of triumph. At 28, she'd become the youngest executive director in the company's history. Instead, the sight of Min-jae's familiar broad shoulders and sharp jawline turned her perfect morning into a nightmare. Their eyes met through the glass walls of his office. For a split second, Min-jae's carefully maintained mask of indifference cracked. The expensive coffee cup in his hand slipped, shattering against his desk and staining important documents with dark liquid. Seo-yeon's portfolio dropped from her trembling fingers, sending papers flying across the floor like scattered memories of their past. "Executive Director Lee," Min-jae's voice carried across the suddenly silent office as he stood, straightening his tie. "Welcome to SK Investment." The words were professional, cold, nothing like the warm whispers of "my Seo-yeon" she remembered from 5 years ago. Back then, they were just a rising financial analyst and a junior executive in love, planning a future together. Until the morning of their wedding, when Min-jae disappeared without explanation, leaving only a brief note. "I'm sorry. I can't." Now here they were, forced to face each other across boardroom tables and corporate meetings. The engagement ring she'd thrown into the Han River might be gone, but the questions still haunted her. Why did he leave? What changed? And how could she possibly work alongside the man who broke not just her heart, but her trust in love itself? Board members watched their interaction with poorly concealed interest, already whispering behind their hands. Seo-yeon lifted her chin, refusing to let 5 years of hard work crumble because of this twist of fate. She'd built her career from the ashes of their broken engagement, and she wouldn't let his presence shake her now. "Thank you for the welcome, CEO Park," she replied, her voice steady despite the storm in her heart. "I look forward to working with you on the upcoming merger." The merger documents felt heavier than usual in Seo-yeon's hands as she walked into the conference room at 8:45 a.m. She deliberately arrived early to arrange her presentation materials, a habit that had served her well throughout her career. The morning sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the polished conference table, where she'd soon face Min-jae again. Her assistant had delivered the news yesterday evening. CEO Park had requested detailed financial reports from her department, specifically the ones she'd personally overseen. The message came in a crisp email, his formal tone a far cry from the playful notes he used to leave in her coat pocket years ago. "Did you hear?" whispered Young-ah, her colleague from marketing, sliding into the seat beside her. "The whole floor is talking about how CEO Park and Director Lee nearly collided in the elevator yesterday. They say the tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife." Seo-yeon kept her face carefully neutral as she arranged her folders. "Office gossip isn't productive, Young-ah. We should focus on the merger." But even as she spoke, she caught Min-jae entering the conference room from her peripheral vision. He moved with the same quiet confidence she remembered, though his shoulders seemed to carry more weight now. He'd switched to wearing silver cufflinks instead of the gold ones she'd given him for their first anniversary. Throughout the meeting, Min-jae's eyes burned into her with unusual intensity as she presented the quarterly projections. She noticed how his jaw clenched when she mentioned potential partnerships, the same way it used to when he was holding back words he couldn't say. During her lunch break, Seo-yeon discovered through casual conversation with his secretary that Min-jae had never married after leaving her. The information shouldn't have affected her, but it lodged in her chest like a splinter she couldn't remove. The merger announcement with Rivera Industries came that afternoon, dropping like a bomb in their already complicated dynamic. Seo-yeon's reputation for handling complex international deals had earned her the position of lead analyst. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd have to work directly with Min-jae for the next 3 months. "We'll need daily progress reports," Min-jae stated during the project briefing, his voice professional but strained. "Your office will be relocated to the East Wing, adjacent to mine, for better coordination." Seo-yeon's heart raced as she realized the implications. The East Wing meant sharing the same break room, the same elevator bank, the same view of the Han River where she'd thrown away their promises. She caught Min-jae stealing glances at her when he thought she wasn't looking, his fingers absently touching the drawer where she'd later learn he kept their old engagement photo. The HR director, Mrs. Kim, pulled her aside after the meeting. "Director Lee, given your history with CEO Park, should we be concerned about any potential conflicts of interest?" "The only conflict," Seo-yeon replied firmly, "will be if Rivera Industries tries to undervalue our assets. I assure you, my personal history won't affect my professional judgment." But as she worked late that evening, the office empty except for the distant hum of cleaning staff, she found herself standing in front of the coffee machine, the same brand Min-jae had insisted on installing in their almost shared home. The familiar aroma brought back memories of lazy Sunday mornings and promises of forever, until the sound of footsteps made her turn to find Min-jae frozen in the doorway, both of them trapped in a moment neither had planned for. Their eyes met across the break room, and for a moment, neither moved. Min-jae recovered first, adjusting his tie, that familiar nervous habit that made Seo-yeon's chest tighten. "Working late again?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "The Rivera merger won't analyze itself," she replied, turning back to the coffee machine. Her fingers trembled slightly as she pressed the buttons, muscle memory selecting his preferred Americano setting before catching herself and switching to her own latte choice. The next morning's board meeting felt like walking into a lion's den. Seo-yeon stood at the front of the room, her merger analysis projected on the screen behind her. The early morning sun caught the silver threads in Min-jae's hair as he studied her presentation with unnervingly focused attention. "Your revenue projections seem optimistic," Min-jae interrupted, leaning forward, "particularly considering Rivera's recent market volatility in Southeast Asia." Seo-yeon felt every eye in the room shift between them. "With respect, CEO Park, I've tracked Rivera's performance for the past 3 years. Their apparent volatility masks a strategic repositioning." She pulled up a detailed graph she'd prepared, knowing he would challenge this point. "Their losses were calculated risks, not market failures." Director Kim nodded appreciatively. "Impressive analysis, Director Lee. I suggest we put her in charge of negotiations with Rivera's board." Min-jae's pen stilled against his notepad. The same notepad style he'd used when planning their wedding, Seo-yeon noticed absently. "Agreed," he said finally. "Director Lee has demonstrated the necessary expertise." Later that day, they ended up alone in the elevator to the parking garage. Seo-yeon pressed herself against the back wall, but the enclosed space felt thick with unspoken words. Min-jae's cologne, still the same sandalwood scent, mixed with the coffee on his breath as he checked his phone. "Your presentation was thorough," he said suddenly, still staring at his screen. "You've come far from the junior analyst who used to fall asleep reading financial reports." The memory hit her like a physical blow. Nights spent on his apartment floor, surrounded by papers, his jacket draped over her shoulders as she dozed off. "People change," she managed. 5 years is a long time. The elevator dinged, and as Min-jae stepped out, his briefcase knocked against the wall, spilling several documents. They both reached down simultaneously, hands brushing as they grabbed for the same paper. Seo-yeon caught a glimpse of what looked like their old engagement photo tucked into his portfolio before he hastily gathered everything. "The client meeting in Busan next week," he said, straightening his jacket. "We'll need to travel together. My secretary will send you the details." Seo-yeon watched him walk away, her hand still tingling where they'd touched. Her phone buzzed. An email from an anonymous address. "Does the board know their CEO left his fiancée at the altar? Interesting merger dynamics ahead." She deleted the email, but its implications followed her home, mixing with the memory of Min-jae's cologne in the elevator and the ghost of their photo hidden in his briefcase. Tomorrow's company dinner would be interesting, to say the least. The company dinner buzzed with nervous energy as executives filled the private room at Le Ciel, Seoul's newest rooftop restaurant. Seo-yeon adjusted her blazer, grateful that she'd chosen the navy silk blouse that made her feel armored. The city lights sparkled through floor-to-ceiling windows, but her attention kept drifting to Min-jae at the head of the table, his shoulders tense as he reviewed documents between courses. "Director Lee," called Director Kim, pulling out the chair beside him. "I'd love your thoughts on the Rivera merger's impact on our Southeast Asian holdings." His voice carried just enough to draw attention from nearby colleagues. Min-jae's pen paused mid-stroke. Seo-yeon took a measured sip of water before responding. "Actually, I've prepared a detailed analysis of potential risks we haven't addressed." She pulled out her tablet, hyper-aware of Min-jae's gaze. "Their subsidiary in Malaysia shows concerning patterns in their quarterly reports." "Patterns I've already reviewed and dismissed," Min-jae cut in, his voice carrying that same authoritative tone he'd used when convincing her father to approve their engagement. "The fluctuations are within acceptable margins." "With respect," Seo-yeon countered, sliding her tablet toward Director Kim. "These aren't mere fluctuations. The same pattern appeared before their Thailand venture collapsed in 2021. Her fingers trembled slightly as she zoomed into the graph. "We're risking billions on assumptions that the data doesn't support." The room grew quiet enough to hear ice clinking in glasses. Min-jae's jaw tightened, that subtle tell she remembered from their late-night arguments about their future. "You're suggesting I haven't done proper due diligence?" "I'm suggesting we need more time before committing." Seo-yeon met his gaze steadily, even as her heart raced. "The same way you needed more time 5 years ago." "Sometimes hesitation is wisdom, isn't it?" Several executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Director Kim cleared his throat, studying the figures with exaggerated interest. "These projections are concerning. Perhaps we should schedule an emergency board meeting for tomorrow?" "Agreed," Min-jae said curtly, gathering his papers. 9 a.m. Director Lee, prepare a full presentation." He stood abruptly, buttoning his jacket. "If you'll excuse me, I have calls to make." As he strode out, Seo-yeon's phone lit up with another anonymous email. "Brave move. But did you know Rivera's CEO was at your almost wedding? Interesting coincidence that Min-jae is pushing this merger so hard." Later that night, as Seo-yeon worked in her office, the door opened without a knock. Min-jae stood there, tie loosened, looking more disheveled than she'd seen him since that rainy morning at the cathedral. "You're right," he said quietly. "About Rivera. About the risks." He ran a hand through his hair. "But there are things you don't know. Things I couldn't tell you then, and can't tell you now." "More secrets, Min-jae?" Seo-yeon's voice cracked slightly. "That worked out so well last time." He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the faint scar above his eyebrow from their college hiking accident. "Some secrets protect people we care about." "You taught me that." The weight of unspoken words hung between them, heavier than the merger documents scattered across her desk. Outside, thunder rolled across the city, promising another storm. Seo-yeon's fingers curled around her pen, thunder still echoing outside. "What do you mean I taught you that?" "I was always honest with you, Min-jae. Even when it hurt." He leaned against her desk, too close, the familiar scent of his cologne making her chest tight. "The merger documents. We need to review them tonight." His voice was professional again, but his eyes held something else. "The board meeting tomorrow." "Now?" "It's almost midnight." But she was already reaching for her laptop, muscle memory from countless late nights they'd spent planning their future together. The office felt smaller as they sat at her conference table, papers spread between them like a barrier. Every time their hands brushed reaching for the same document, electricity crackled through the air. The storm outside intensified, rain pelting against the windows. "Look at this," Seo-yeon pointed to a clause buried in page 237. "The Malaysian subsidiary's debt structure. It's almost identical to the pattern before their Singapore collapse." Min-jae leaned closer, his shoulder brushing hers. "That's impossible. I reviewed these personally." His voice trailed off as he studied the numbers. The furrow between his brows deepened, the same look he'd worn when she'd questioned their wedding venue choice. "Coffee?" she offered, standing abruptly, needing distance. But as she turned, her elbow caught his cup. Dark liquid spread across white papers, a perfect mirror of that morning 5 years ago when she'd spilled coffee on their wedding plans in his apartment. They both reached for the napkins, fingers colliding. Min-jae's hand closed over hers for a heartbeat too long. The touch sent memories flooding back. Lazy Sunday mornings, stolen kisses between meetings, promises whispered under starlit skies. "I'll get fresh copies," he said roughly, pulling away. But before he could stand, Director Park burst through the door, looking flustered despite the late hour. "CEO Jung, Director Lee, the Rivera merger documents. There's something you need to see." He paused, taking in their proximity, the spilled coffee, the tension thick enough to cut. "Am I interrupting?" "Not at all," Seo-yeon said smoothly, straightening her blazer. "In fact, I was just explaining to CEO Jung why this merger needs serious reconsideration." She pulled up her analysis on the projector, grateful for the professional distraction. "These numbers don't lie." As she presented her findings, other executives filtered in, drawn by the lights and voices. Min-jae watched her, his expression unreadable, as she systematically dismantled the merger's foundation. With each point she made, his carefully constructed wall of authority crumbled a little more. Her phone buzzed again. "Dinner tomorrow night. Rivera CEO insists on meeting both of you. Dress code, formal. Some old wedding guests might attend." Min-jae's phone lit up at the same moment. Their eyes met across the room, 5 years of questions suspended in the space between them. The tension in the room thickened as more executives filed in, their phones buzzing with the same dinner invitation. Min-jae cleared his throat, adjusting his tie. "We'll need to prepare a comprehensive analysis before tomorrow's dinner." His voice carried authority, but Seo-yeon caught the slight tremor in his hands as he gathered the coffee-stained papers. Director Park hovered by the projector, glancing between them. "The Rivera team specifically requested both of you present the merger strategy together. They seem particularly interested in your dynamic." Seo-yeon's laptop screen blurred as memories of their last formal dinner together crashed over her. The rehearsal dinner where everything had started to unravel. She forced herself to focus on the financial data, but the numbers swam before her eyes. "We'll need the conference room all day," Min-jae announced, his CEO mask firmly in place. "Cancel my other appointments." He paused, then added softly, "Please have someone bring us fresh coffee." The next 12 hours became a dance of professional distance and unavoidable proximity. Every time Seo-yeon reached for a document, she felt Min-jae's eyes on her hands, the hands that once wore his ring. When she stood at the whiteboard, mapping out subsidiary connections, his shoulder brushed hers as he added his own notes, their handwriting intertwining just like it used to on their shared calendar. "Your analysis of the Malaysian numbers," he said during a brief lunch break, pushing a sandwich toward her like he used to during their late-night study sessions. "It's brilliant, but also dangerous," she finished, their old habit of completing each other's thoughts surfacing unbidden. "If we expose this pattern, the entire merger could collapse." A junior analyst knocked and entered, carrying fresh financial reports. She stopped short, sensing the charged atmosphere. "Sorry, should I come back?" "No," they said in unison, then shared a startled look. As afternoon faded into evening, their professional facades began to crack. Min-jae loosened his tie, rolling up his sleeves, a gesture so familiar it made Seo-yeon's heart ache. She caught him staring at her when she tucked her hair behind her ear, a habit he used to tease her about. The security guard's midnight rounds interrupted Min-jae just as he was reaching across the table, his fingers almost touching her arm. "CEO Jung, Director Lee. The building's closing. We'll finish this at dinner tomorrow," Seo-yeon said, gathering her things quickly. But as she turned to leave, she noticed Min-jae's office safe slightly ajar. Inside, bound in faded blue leather, sat their wedding planning notebook, its edges worn from repeated handling. She pretended not to see it, but her hands shook as she picked up her briefcase. Tomorrow's dinner would be more than just a merger presentation. It would be a reckoning with all the words they'd left unspoken 5 years ago. The morning brought chaos as news of the anonymous tip spread through the office like wildfire. Seo-yeon's phone buzzed incessantly with messages from concerned team members as she strode through the lobby, her heels clicking against the marble floor with determined precision. The emergency board meeting notification had arrived at dawn, leaving her just hours to prepare her defense. She found her team huddled in the conference room, their faces drawn with worry. Director Lee, Ji-won, her deputy, stepped forward. "We've prepared a complete portfolio of your merger recommendations. Every decision is backed by data." Seo-yeon's hands trembled slightly as she accepted the folder, but her voice remained steady. "Thank you. But this isn't just about numbers anymore." The boardroom felt colder than usual as executives filed in, their whispers echoing off the glass walls. Min Jae entered last, his face unreadable as he took his seat at the head of the table. The chairman's announcement cut through the tension like a knife. An anonymous source has raised serious concerns about the objectivity of this merger, given the personal history between CEO Young and Director Lee. Seo-yeon felt every eye in the room turn to her. She stood, her spine straight as steel. "My professional record speaks for itself. Every recommendation I've made is supported by thorough market analysis." "The board suggests appointing an alternative team leader," someone interrupted. The words hung in the air like poison. Min Jae remained silent, his pen tapping rhythmically against his notepad. His silence cut deeper than any accusation could have. Hours later, when the office had emptied and darkness pressed against the windows, Seo-yeon sat alone in the merger documentation room. The soft hum of the air conditioning couldn't mask the sound of approaching footsteps. Footsteps she still recognized after 5 years. "You should have defended me," she said without turning around. Min Jae's reflection appeared in the window beside her. Would that have helped? Or would it have confirmed their suspicions? Since when does Min Jae-jung care about appearances? She spun to face him, folders clutched to her chest like armor. "Since your career became collateral damage." His voice softened. "The board doesn't know I rejected 3 merger proposals before you joined the company. They don't need to know I've watched your interview video more times than I can count." The revelation stunned her into silence. A security guard passed by, his flashlight beam sweeping across the floor between them. "Someone's trying to sabotage more than just the merger," Min Jae continued, moving closer. "The leak came from inside. Someone who knows about us, about that day." The mention of that day made Seo-yeon's chest tighten. Before she could respond, her phone lit up with an urgent message. The board had set a 1-week deadline to resolve the leadership question, and their biggest merger partners were demanding an emergency meeting in Singapore. "We're running out of time," Min Jae said, his hand hovering near hers on the desk. "And I think we both know there's only one way to save this deal." The unspoken solution hung between them. They would have to face their past together, thousands of miles from the safety of their professional masks. The Singapore Airlines flight gave Seo-yeon 6 hours to fortify her emotional defenses, but the tropical heat that hit her face as she stepped into Changi Airport melted her resolve. Min Jae walked slightly ahead, his suit jacket slung over one shoulder as he navigated them through the terminal with practiced ease. The familiar way he guided her with a light touch to her elbow, muscle memory from years ago, made her pulse quicken. "There's been a booking issue," Min Jae announced as they reached the hotel's marble-floored lobby. "The conference has filled most rooms. We're in adjacent suites on the executive floor." Seo-yeon's grip tightened on her briefcase. "Of course we are," she muttered, accepting her keycard with forced professionalism. The evening brought an unexpected ally, a torrential downpour that trapped them in the hotel, the sheets of rain transforming Singapore's skyline into a blur of neon watercolors. The scene was a cruel echo of their first date, when they'd sought shelter from similar rain in a tiny cafe near Namsan Tower. "We should review the merger documents," Seo-yeon suggested, desperate for the safety of spreadsheets and statistics. They sat up in the hotel's executive lounge, empty except for the soft jazz playing overhead. Hours passed as they combed through financial reports. The familiar rhythm of their collaboration, her attention to detail complementing his strategic vision, made it easy to forget the weight of their shared history, until she noticed Min Jae watching her with an intensity that had nothing to do with profit margins. "You still do that," he said softly. "Do what?" "Twirl your pen when you're about to find something important." He leaned closer, pointing to a row of numbers. "Like this discrepancy in the third quarter projections. The discovery should have been triumphant, but Seo-yeon's focus scattered as she caught the faint scent of his cologne, the same one from 5 years ago. She pushed back from the table, needing distance. "I should get some rest." "Seo-yeon." His voice stopped her. "I saw the competitor's CEO watching you at dinner. Kim Sung-ho has a reputation for using personal relationships to gain leverage in deals." The implied warning carried an edge of possession that made her anger flare. "I don't need protection, Min-jae. You lost that right when you left me standing alone in my wedding dress." Before he could respond, both their phones chimed simultaneously. The message made Seo-yeon's blood run cold. "Ask your CEO why he really ran from the wedding. The board might find his family's secret interesting." Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, lightning illuminated the city, casting harsh shadows across Min-jae's suddenly pale face. The rain continued its relentless drumming, trapping them with questions that had waited 5 years for answers. The anonymous text message hung between them like a physical presence, its threat echoing off the rain-streaked windows. Seo-yeon watched Min-jae's hands clench around his phone, his knuckles white with tension. "Someone's been planning this," he said, his voice barely audible above the storm. "The hotel arrangements, the merger discrepancies, now this message. It's too coordinated." Before Seo-yeon could respond, her phone buzzed again. This time it was a news alert from Korea's leading business journal. Her stomach dropped as she saw the headline. "SK Investments CEO's abandoned wedding. Questions of leadership stability arise." Beneath it was a photo she'd burned years ago, herself in her wedding dress, mascara-stained tears running down her face as she stood alone at the altar. "The board's already calling for an emergency meeting," Min-jae said, scrolling through his emails. "Our stock dropped 12% in after-hours trading." Seo-yeon's professional instincts kicked in, temporarily overshadowing her personal turmoil. "The timing's suspicious. Right when we found irregularities in the merger documents." "Sung-ho," Min-jae growled, pacing the length of the lounge. "He must have sources inside SK Investment. The question is who?" A sharp knock interrupted them. The hotel's night manager stood in the doorway looking apologetic. "Mr. Kim, Ms. Park, I have urgent messages from your board members. They're requesting an immediate video conference." The next hour became a blur of damage control. Seated side by side at the conference table, they faced a wall of stern faces on the video screen. Board member Young's voice cut through the static. "This personal history compromises the entire merger. Park must be removed from the team immediately." "With all due respect," Seo-yeon interjected, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I've found serious discrepancies in the merger documentation that require immediate attention. Removing me now would prevent a conflict of interest," another board member finished. "Mr. Kim, you have until morning to make this decision, or we'll call for a vote of no confidence." After the call ended, Min-jae slumped in his chair, looking more vulnerable than she'd seen him since that day 5 years ago. "Seo-yeon, what I never told you about the wedding? My father's involvement in—" "Don't," she cut him off, gathering her papers with trembling hands. "Whatever you're about to say, it won't change what happened. Right now, we need to focus on who's trying to destroy both our careers." But as she turned to leave, his next words froze her in place. "The fraud in these documents, it leads back to my family. The same reason I left you at the altar. And if we don't stop this merger, history's about to repeat itself." Lightning flashed again, illuminating the conflict on Seo-yeon's face as she stood caught between professional duty and the undeniable pull of 5 years' worth of unanswered questions. Rain pelted against the windows as Seo-yeon stared at Min-jae, his last words about family fraud hanging heavy in the air. Before she could respond, her phone lit up with another notification, this time from an unknown source containing confidential merger documents already circulating through major news outlets. "The entire Kim Park merger proposal," she whispered, scrolling through the leaked files with trembling fingers. "Someone just exposed everything." Min-jae's face drained of color as he grabbed his laptop, frantically refreshing financial news sites. "Our stock, it's in free fall. 20% down and dropping." The night manager burst in again, this time with visible panic. "Mr. Kim, the board chairman is demanding an emergency meeting. They're all gathering in the main office right now." As they rushed through the rain-slicked streets in Min-jae's car, Seo-yeon's phone wouldn't stop buzzing with messages from board members and reporters. But one text caught her eye. From her old security chief at SK Investment. Found something in the archives. Wedding day footage you need to see. The boardroom was chaos when they arrived. Elderly men in expensive suits shouted over each other while screens displayed plummeting stock prices and damaging headlines. Board member Jung slammed his fist on the table as they entered. This is exactly what we feared. Personal drama destroying shareholder value. And now look. Sung-ho Corp is making a hostile takeover bid. Min-jae stepped forward, his composed facade cracking slightly. The leaked documents are doctored. Someone's trying to force our hand. Then explain this, another board member said, sliding a folder across the table. Inside were security photos of Min-jae and Seo-yeon's late-night meetings at the hotel, with sensational headlines suggesting corporate espionage. As accusations flew around the room, Seo-yeon's phone buzzed again. The security footage had arrived. Her breath caught as she watched. Min-jae's father in her bridal suite 5 years ago making a phone call. It's done. He won't make it to the ceremony. The evidence we planted will keep them apart. She looked up to find Min-jae watching her, understanding dawning in his eyes. But before either could speak, his father burst into the boardroom. I've negotiated a solution, the elder Kim announced. Sung-ho Corp will withdraw their takeover bid on one condition. Seo-yeon steps down and publicly takes responsibility for the merger's failure. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to her. Min-jae stepped forward, but she raised her hand to stop him. Before anyone makes any decisions, she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. There's some security footage from 5 years ago that the board needs to see. The security footage played on the boardroom's massive screen, casting harsh shadows across the stunned faces of the board members. The timestamp showed 9:47 a.m., exactly 3 hours before what should have been Seo-yeon's wedding. The elder Kim's voice rang clear through the speakers. Make sure the evidence looks convincing. She can never know it was fabricated. Min-jae stood frozen, his knuckles white against the back of his chair. Father, what did you do? The elder Kim's composed facade cracked slightly. Everything I did was to protect this company. Your marriage to a small firm executive's daughter would have weakened our position with the shareholders. Weakened our position? Min-jae's voice trembled with barely contained rage. You destroyed her family's company. You made me believe they were criminals. Seo-yeon's fingers flew across her tablet, pulling up additional documents. It wasn't just the wedding day. Look at these transfer records. Systematic dismantling of my father's company assets, all traced back to shell companies owned by Kim Holdings. The board members murmured amongst themselves, passing documents and sharing concerned glances. Board member Jung cleared his throat. Mr. Kim, these allegations, if true, constitute serious corporate misconduct. The statute of limitations, the elder Kim began, but Seo-yeon cut him off, doesn't apply when there's evidence of ongoing fraud. She projected new documents onto the screen. The same shell companies are active in this merger. The same patterns of manipulation. You never stopped, did you? Rain continued to pound against the windows as lightning illuminated the Seoul skyline. The elder Kim's phone buzzed. Another alert about plunging stock prices. The shareholders won't stand for this, board member Park warned, adjusting his glasses. We're looking at potential class action lawsuits. Min-jae stepped forward, his voice steady despite his visible distress. I move to temporarily suspend my father from all executive functions pending a full investigation. You ungrateful, the elder Kim sputtered, but security was already at the door. As they led his father out, Min-jae turned to Seo-yeon. The weight of 5 years of misunderstandings hung between them. I should have trusted you, he said softly. I should have asked questions instead of believing the worst. We both should have, she replied, gathering her documents. But right now we have a company to save and a merger to salvage. Her phone buzzed again. Sung-ho Corp was withdrawing their hostile takeover bid. The leaked documents had worked in their favor, exposing the elder Kim's manipulation, rather than destroying the merger's credibility. Board member Jung stood, straightening his tie. Ms. Park, The board would like to formally request your assistance in restructuring the merger agreement, without outside interference this time. The storm outside began to ease, but the night was far from over. As the board members filed out to begin damage control, Min-jae caught Seo-yeon's arm. "There's something else you need to see. About the real reason I came back to Korea." Min-jae led Seo-yeon to his office, his hand hovering near the small of her back but never quite touching. The familiar gesture, or rather the careful absence of it, made her heart constrict. Inside, he pulled a worn leather portfolio from his desk drawer, the same one she'd given him on their first anniversary. "I found these while investigating the merger irregularities," he said, spreading documents across his desk. "Look at the dates." Seo-yeon leaned closer, her shoulder brushing against his. Financial records, board meeting minutes, and email threads painted a disturbing picture. The manipulation of her family's company hadn't been a one-time event. It was part of a years-long strategy orchestrated by the elder Kim. "He was afraid," Min-jae explained, his voice rough. "Not just of losing face with the shareholders. These show he was terrified of your business insight. The way you spotted patterns others missed. He knew you'd eventually uncover his whole network of shell companies." A notification lit up both their phones simultaneously. The stock price had dropped another 3% in after-hours trading. Seo-yeon rubbed her temples, exhaustion seeping into her bones. "We need to stabilize the company before the market opens. There's more." Min-jae pulled up security footage on his laptop. "Watch the parking garage cameras from last week." The grainy video showed the elder Kim meeting with executives from rival companies, including Sungho Corp. He was playing both sides, Seo-yeon realized, creating a crisis so he could sweep in with a solution that would cement his control. "I came back to Korea because I started finding discrepancies in our international branches," Min-jae admitted. "I never imagined it would lead back to that day." The office felt smaller suddenly, the late hour and shared revelations creating an intimacy neither was prepared for. Seo-yeon noticed the photo frame on his desk was face down, the same one she'd glimpsed earlier. "Why did you keep it?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. Min-jae's fingers brushed the frame but didn't lift it. "Some mistakes you want to remember, to make sure you never repeat them." A knock interrupted them. The crisis management team needed immediate decisions on press statements and market strategies. Reality crashed back in, but something had shifted. As they walked to the conference room, their steps fell into the same rhythm they'd had 5 years ago. The night stretched ahead, filled with urgent calls and emergency meetings. But beneath the corporate crisis, old wounds were beginning to heal, and buried truths were finally surfacing. The question was whether they could save both the company and whatever remained of their hearts. Thunder rolled outside as they entered the packed conference room, both knowing that by morning, nothing would be the same. The conference room buzzed with tension as executives hurriedly took their seats. Seo-yeon watched the latest stock figures flash across the wall screen, each update more concerning than the last. She felt Min-jae's presence behind her, his breath catching slightly when their financial director announced another 2% drop in Singapore markets. "We need immediate action," barked Director Park through the video feed. "The morning papers are already speculating about insider trading." Seo-yeon was about to respond when her phone vibrated. The message made her blood run cold. Chairman Kim arriving at Changi Airport, ETA to office 30 minutes. She glanced at Min-jae, who had received the same alert. His jaw tightened, the muscle working beneath his skin. 5 years ago, she'd traced that same jawline with her fingertips. Now she watched him struggle with the same realization she had. His father's arrival could only mean trouble. "I've found something," she announced, pulling up the merger documents on her tablet. "Look at Section 7.4, the ownership transfer clauses. The language is deliberately vague, creating a loophole that would allow for immediate board restructuring post-merger." Min-jae leaned over her shoulder, his cologne, still the same after all these years, momentarily derailing her thoughts. "This wasn't in the original draft," he muttered, scrolling through the paragraphs. "Someone altered the documents after legal approval." The conference room door burst open. Chairman Kim strode in, his presence immediately commanding attention. "I'll handle this situation personally," he announced, eyes fixing on Seo-yeon with barely concealed hostility. "Miss Han, a word in private." Any discussions about the merger should include all key stakeholders, Seo-yeon replied steadily, though her heart hammered against her ribs. Father. Min-jae stepped forward, positioning himself slightly between them. There are questions about certain document alterations that need addressing first. The chairman's face darkened. Questions that wouldn't exist if you'd done your duty 5 years ago instead of running to New York. His words cut through the room like ice. Now, Miss Han. My office. As Seo-yeon gathered her materials, a security alert flashed on her phone. Footage from the building's parking garage showing Chairman Kim meeting with Sung-ho Corp executives just hours earlier. She caught Min-jae's eye, a silent understanding passing between them. Whatever his father was planning, it went deeper than anyone suspected. The walk to the chairman's office felt like marching to battle. Behind them, Min-jae was already pulling up building security feeds on his phone, his free hand clenched in a fist. The same way it had been the morning he'd left her waiting at the altar. Some habits, it seemed, died harder than others. Rain lashed against the windows, the storm outside matching the turmoil within. As Chairman Kim closed his office door, Seo-yeon squared her shoulders. She'd lost everything once before, her love, her pride, her trust. This time, she was ready to fight back. Chairman Kim's office felt like a pressure chamber, the rain drumming against floor-to-ceiling windows providing an ominous soundtrack. Seo-yeon remained standing, her tablet clutched against her chest like armor. You've become quite the thorn in my side, Chairman Kim said, settling into his leather chair. Just like 5 years ago. Before Seo-yeon could respond, her phone buzzed with an urgent news alert. SK Investments stock had plummeted another 5% in the last hour. Simultaneously, her email notification showed an anonymous tip to major news outlets about potential fraud in the merger documentation. Interesting timing, she said carefully, watching the chairman's face. The same morning you arrive from Singapore, our stock crashes and merger documents are questioned. Chairman Kim's composed facade cracked slightly. You dare accuse... His words cut off as he clutched his chest, face contorting in pain. Seo-yeon rushed forward instinctively, corporate warfare forgotten in the face of a medical emergency. Security! She called out, already dialing emergency services. Min-jae burst through the door seconds later, his face paling at the sight of his father slumped over the desk. The next hours passed in a blur of ambulance sirens and hospital corridors. Seo-yeon found herself pacing the waiting room, unable to leave despite everything. Min-jae sat rigid in a plastic chair, his usually perfect tie loosened, sleeve cuffs unbuttoned. Why are you still here? He asked quietly, not looking at her. Because 5 years ago, you disappeared without explanation. I won't let history repeat itself without knowing the truth. The doctor's arrival interrupted them. Chairman Kim is stable, but he's asking to speak with Miss Han. Alone. In the dimly lit hospital room, Chairman Kim looked smaller somehow. Vulnerable in ways Seo-yeon had never imagined possible. I owe you a confession, he said, his voice rough. That day at the wedding, I made him leave. The truth spilled out like poison being drained from a wound. How he'd threatened to destroy her family's small business if Min-jae went through with the marriage. How he'd orchestrated the current merger crisis to force his son's resignation, fearing Min-jae's growing independence. Why tell me now? Seo-yeon asked, her hands trembling. Because my son hasn't smiled since that day, Chairman Kim replied, closing his eyes. And now I've lost everything anyway. Back in her office that evening, Seo-yeon pieced together the evidence linking rival firm Sung-ho Corp to the leaked documents. Her door opened, revealing Min-jae with his own stack of files. I've been investigating my father's dealings for years, he said, placing a USB drive on her desk. I never knew about the threat to your family, but I knew something wasn't right that day. The office security alarm suddenly blared, red lights flashing through the corridors. On Seo-yeon's computer screen, the security feed showed masked figures in the document storage room. Simultaneously, her phone lit up with an alert. Chairman Kim had vanished from his hospital room. Min-jae's hand found hers in the chaos, an echo of a touch from 5 years ago. We need to move fast, he said, his grip tightening. Whatever's happening, we face it together this time. The emergency lights cast an eerie red glow through the office as Min-jae and Seo-yeon raced down the corridor, their footsteps echoing against marble floors. The security feed on Seo-yeon's phone showed the masked intruders had already accessed the main server room. "The merger documents," Seo-yeon gasped, skidding to a halt. "If they destroy those files, the board meeting won't matter," Min-jae finished, loosening his tie completely. "We'll have nothing to prove the manipulation." They reached the server room door, just as a crash sounded from inside. Min-jae pressed Seo-yeon against the wall, his body shielding hers as voices approached. The familiar scent of his cologne brought back memories of their first corporate dinner, before everything fell apart. "I have a backup," she whispered against his shoulder. "But it's in my apartment." His eyes met hers in the dim light. "Your old apartment? The one near Hongdae? You remember?" Before he could answer, his phone buzzed. The message made his jaw clench. "Vote against merger by 9 a.m., or father releases evidence of Han family tax fraud." Seo-yeon's phone lit up seconds later. "Support CEO removal or Min-jae's illegal overseas accounts go public." They stared at each other, 5 years of hurt and mistrust crystallizing in this moment. The sound of approaching security guards echoed through the hallway. "We have 3 hours until the board meeting," Min-jae said, checking his watch. "My father's clearly behind this, but we need proof." "I know where to find it," Seo-yeon replied, pulling up an email on her tablet. "That night at the hospital, before he disappeared, your father accidentally left his phone unlocked. I saw an address in his recent messages, a private office in Gangnam. Rain hammered against the windows as they made their way to the parking garage. Min-jae's hand hadn't left the small of her back, a gesture so familiar it hurt. The security guard at the entrance gave them a curious look as they rushed past, their formal clothes now rumpled from the night's chaos. "Why didn't you tell me about my father's threat?" Min-jae asked as they reached his car. 5 years ago? Seo-yeon's fingers froze on the door handle. "The same reason you never told me you were investigating him all this time." Sometimes protecting someone means keeping secrets. The city lights blurred past as they drove through the storm, each lost in thoughts of what could have been. The radio crackled with breaking news about SK Investment's stock crisis and rumors of corporate espionage. In 3 hours, they would face the board and each other's truths. But first, they had to survive the night. The emergency lights flickered as Min-jae and Seo-yeon burst into the boardroom, their footsteps echoing across marble floors. Dawn painted Seoul's skyline in shades of gold and pink, the same colors from that fateful wedding morning 5 years ago. But this time, they faced the sunrise together. Min-jae's father stood at the head of the boardroom table, a stack of documents clutched in his trembling hands. "I have proof," he announced to the assembled board members, "that Ms. Lee has been manipulating company assets." "No." Min-jae's voice cut through the tension. He placed a USB drive on the table. "What we have is 5 years of evidence showing systematic manipulation orchestrated by you, father." Seo-yeon stepped forward, her tablet displaying transaction records and emails, including the threats against my family's business the day before our wedding. Her voice remained steady, professional, though her hands shook slightly. "And the current attempt to sabotage the merger." The board members whispered among themselves as security escorted Min-jae's father from the building. The merger vote passed unanimously, but neither Min-jae nor Seo-yeon celebrated immediately. There were still words unspoken between them. That evening, they found themselves back at Hanyang University's cherry blossom path where they'd first met. Min-jae pulled out a wrinkled envelope from his suit jacket, their unsigned marriage contract. "I couldn't bring myself to throw it away," he admitted quietly. Seo-yeon reached into her bag, withdrawing her own worn envelope, her unsigned resignation letter from 5 years ago. Neither could I. Their laughter mixed with the evening breeze, carrying away years of misunderstandings and pain. Sometimes the longest detours led to exactly where you were meant to be. 3 months later, at the opening of SK Investment's Singapore branch, Min-jae and Seo-yeon stood together at the podium. Their wedding rings caught the light as they signed the final merger documents. The assembled executives applauded, but the couple only had eyes for each other. No glass walls or corporate titles between them anymore. "Ready to lead this company together?" Min-jae whispered as cameras flashed. Seo-yeon smiled, remembering that first terrifying day she'd stepped into his office. "We already are." They had learned that some walls needed to crumble for stronger foundations to be built. Their love story hadn't followed a straight path, but every detour had made them stronger, as leaders, as partners, and as equals. In the end, time hadn't healed their wounds. Understanding and truth had. And now, standing shoulder to shoulder, they faced their future exactly as they should have all along, together.